Here's the golden oldie, the famous book, Secret of the Jew or something like that, where or Netzach Yisrael, whatever it is. And this is how to build a mikveh in your house for $5. Back in the 1920s, wrote 100 years ago. L'shem Shamayim, he thought he tried his best to revive, not even revive, to vive the practice of mikvah of Taras Mishpach in America where it didn't exist. See, he's got all kind of ways to include it in your household furniture. A bare minimum mikvah, which would be kosher. And one of the big things in his book is that you can use a regular tap water, maybe with a rubber hose, I think I remember. And you can turn on the faucet. And that's okay for a mikvah, he said. Um, as they say, you just have to make sure it's not zochel, that the water is stationary wherever it lands. And to tell you the truth, Rabbi David Miller was not alone. I think, let's put it this way, the Aruch HaShulchan in Reish Aleph, Sif Cotton 169, Kuf Samach Tes, says you can, where he lived, they used the reservoir, the tap water in Russia. Most of the mikvahs in America and in England before the Second World War, I'm talking about in the year of the Agudas Rabbanim, believe it or not, were from tap water, back in days in the, like I say, in the 30s, the 20s, and all that. I saw in the Taras HaMayim, wonderful sefer Rabbi Tolushkin, which he wrote in 1947. He said even Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who recently came from Russia, said that he used a tap water kind of mikvah under the communists when, Soviet Russia, when they had no choice. The Hasidim, remember the Taras Yontif, the helmets of Rabbi after the Second World War, came to this country like Satmar. He made a personal crusade to change all the mikvahs away from that. But according to everybody else, you need rainwater through pipes, not through faucet, which makes life very complicated. Now, in ancient times, if you read the Mishnayos and Mikvaos, outdoor depressions was filled with rainwater were indeed mikvahs if they didn't leak. Like a hole in the ground. This is clear from the Mishnahs. People just dunked in open air pits or depressions, which is like a yuck, right? I remember in Israel, I was once with a certain tour guide. I will not say his name. He probably would consider it a compliment. He stopped by a place, like a hole in the ground. He said, "Oh, this is a good mikvah." He stripped off and jumped in the mikvah. And that was in summer and warm weather. In the winter, it's a bummer. Now, the idea of rainwater, as opposed to tap water, opposed to mayim shuvin, to me sounds like very California, very organic, in touch with nature and all that business, not man-made. I'm sure they're probably California types. I think I read it once in a book. Not from, but they like the idea of mikvah, natural water, la la la. And I'm sure Chabad, Kiruv guys from California probably use that to get people to use mikvahs. Why not? But it's not so simple. According to Medrashim, like the Rambam, Torah, you can use mayim shuvin. You know what I said? I could fill a whole mikvah with buckets and it'd be kosher. The Rambam says, and I quote, Din Torah, notice Torah, shekol mayim hamechunosim tolim behen. Any kind you get water together, no matter how you got it together, if it's the right amount, you can tovel it. Should never mikveh mayim and call makam. The Torah speaks about mikveh mayim, any gathering of water. It doesn't give any requirements. Provided it's big enough. In other words, there's enough water to be able to dunk yourself in all at one time. That's all you need. Shira chacham ama ama bruma shal shamash machzik arbaim saw bein shuvim ein shuvim. As long as you have 40 saw, it's fine. Divrei sofrim, no, it's midrabanan. Shamayim hashuvim psul netvila. That's drabanan. They say you can't use mayim shuvim. And they also, midrabanan, made a rule that many are familiar with, which is if you only have 40 saw and you pour in directly 3 lugin of mayim shuvin from a cup. So in other words, I have a mikvah almost completely full, but not quite. And let's say it's 37 saw, not 40. And I filled the last 3 saw with mayim shuvin, then it would pass the whole mikvah. I'll be shubsul mayim shuvin divrei sofim, even though the whole thing is only midrabanan. Lamdua behekish, but they have a limud, so to speak. The Rambam is trying to defend this drabanan. I'm sure the Karaites must have complained about this, whatever. A lot of the Rambam is against the Karaite criticism. Shenemar ach mayona bor mikveh mayim yetohar. The Chumash says ach mayona bor mikveh mayim yetohar. Ach mayon ubor mikveh. 3 words are juxtaposed. Hamayan, we know with a mayan, spring, natural spring. Ein bo tfis yadam klal. It's totally natural from the ground. Habor kula b'dei adam. And a bor is something that's filled up a pit by adam. Shari kol mayim shuvim. The Chachamim say, the Rambam says, that a mikveh should be in the middle. A mikveh lo yakul shov kabor, but a circle yakul b'shamayim kamayim, yesh bo tfis yadam kosher. A mikveh is in the middle. So you can have part of it mayim shuvim, and part of it, what do you call it? Not mayim shuvim, rainwater. He means Baham Shachar and all this. He's talking about, he goes on to describe that famous Mishnah. We have all the vessels on the roof. Remember that? Look it up yourself. Can you see it? I think so. And, and the vessels were filled up with rainwater. And then the guy's not pouring it down. He's like mates, inclining it over. And some even say he can pour it. But in this case, I'm Shachar, in this case not, depending whether you go back to North or to Eretz Yisrael. But without getting too technical, the bottom line is that it's all midrabanan. Think about this, because I like to think about history. Long ago, you could make a mikvah by using tap water or pouring it from pails. None of the rainwater difficulties. Your bathtub, if it was mechuber l'karka and not a kli, if it was mechuber l'karka, it would not be a kli, right? Your bathtub would be fine, easy as pie. And then at some point in history, the rabbis came along and made life difficult. They created a lot of difficulties. How many women froze in icy winter rivers and such in Europe because they couldn't use mayim shuvim? How many problems have arisen because of situations of naflu shlosha lugin mayim shuvim kodem shenismali abor arbim saw? A lot of questions and problems with this in the Gemara and in the Shalos and Shivas literature. And really, Torah is not a problem. Or how about the defect of tfisas yedei adam? It shouldn't have any direct human involvement. Torah, you can. Mayim shuvim means me, myself, and I go pick up a bucket. I go and I dump it in the mikveh. That's tfisas yedei adam. It's by me, and it's really okay. Torah is not a problem. Now, Lamaisa, that's the Rambam's opinion. There are many Shitus Rishonim who disagree with the Rambam, and they hold the psul shuvin is midaraisa. But it's surprising, by the way, how many Rishonim restrict the deraisa requirements of rainwater to very specific situations. There's a great one of those nice synthetic paragraphs in the Aruch HaSholta. I love it. And he ties it all together. He quotes the Rambam, and then he says, "V'yeshmi Rabboseinu desvirilu the kula shuva pasal min Torah gimel shuvim betchil nosim betochem pasal min Torah," that they hold, yes, there is a psul min Torah mayim shuvin or gimel lugin before 40 saw. But even if a little bit of water goes into the pit of the mikvah, like a few drops, and then but then you pour in 3 shuvim before you pour in the other 37, it'd be okay, minator. It's psul midrabanan. That's Rabbeinu Talmud Ran. For Yesh Rabbi Seinu Shamri, the mili b'kosef pasal minatora v'shurvim shiyardu they kill me'alim psul midrabanan. The same Rabbi. And some say it's only if you directly pour it in. Like I showed you before, if the water came out without me pouring it, if you look closely, this guy is whacking it like with a hammer. This fellow here, this guy here is whacking it with a hammer. How can I put it closely? Right? I think you see it. So he's not pouring it; he's banging it and causing it to come in. Does that be okay? Right? Then a Torah, I'm saying. The Yeshua Abasinish Sorim, Tishanu became a common Tuma Pasam in a Torah. That the only Mayim Shuvin is in a Torah is when you pour it from, metal or something. It's Makabel Tuma. Avokashin Shabba, Clay Glolim, Clay Avonim, Clay Adom, Shem Makam Tum Pasam Midravan. But if you use the type of Kli, which is not Makabel Tuma, then it's okay in a Torah. Like nowadays you see plastic or something like that. I don't know. Right? And by the way, the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo also holds that the psul shuvin is midrabanan, at least according to the Shach, as in Reish Aleph Siv Cotton Yud. So according to these poskim, the Torah strangely says a mikveh is okay with 38 saw of rainwater and 2 of mayim shuvim, but not with more. Why? And that it's no good only if the mayim shuvim was physically poured by the people and poured in a certain type of vessel, like metal, makabel tumah, not by another one. Why? So mayim shuvim is defined as water poured by a person from a vessel. But what's a vessel? Or more exactly, what if it has a hole? What if it leaks? Which leads me to my becoming interested in a famous but obscure controversy in Jewish history called the Mikvah of Rovigo in the late 16th and early 17th centuries in northern Italy near Venice. Okay, Rovigo is a town near Venice. The whole Jewish population, I think, was 17 people, so very few women. Essentially, there were 2 brothers and their families, the Conciliano family, Aftalion and Yukasio. The local mikvah, which had been a regular mikvah, was ruined by somebody doing home improvements to his house, and the idiot didn't care that he messed up the pipes and all that, so he messed up the mikvah. Aftalion Concilio, who was a Talmid Chacham, thereupon built a mikvah in his backyard, not far from a well, in an interesting and controversial way. He drew water from the well, that's a Mayan, in a bucket and poured it into the mikvah. But wait, that's mayim shuvim. Well, what he did was he made little holes in the bottom of the bucket, and in addition, he made a big hole, like that, on the side of the bucket, which means at the bottom on the side. Not here, but here somewhere. He made little holes, and like at the edge, he made a big hole. Okay. This way, the bucket was not a kli because it leaked, and so the water was not mayim shuvim. And even so, he did not pour it directly from the bucket into the mikvah. Rather, he poured them from the bucket into a wooden pipe that had holes. The pipe lay on the ground and went down into the earth underground into the mikvah. The pipe was more than an amma long, so plenty long, about 20 inches. So not only was the water in the bucket not mayim shuvim, it was also a case of hamshacha, right? That is, the water was not poured directly into the mikvah, it was poured on the ground and rolled into the mikvah. This is how Aftalion constructed the mikvah. I suppose the reason for the bucket with holes was to take care of the problem of mayim shuvim. The Mishnah says, Perek Daled Mishnah 5, Nikva milmaila o min asad, if it has a hole, ve'eni chol kabel mayim kol shem, even if it's a small hole, kishay rav, v'kami benekav kishoferes hanod, it has to be a big hole. And the shoferes hanod, if you look, there is only min asad, like I said before, and not milmata. So at the bottom, little holes are okay. But what's with the hamshacha into the water pipe? Well, that was to take care of a different problem, namely, havyaso aideonim, or tfisaso aideonim, meaning that the Torah says, ach mayonavor mikveh mayim yeh tahor, quote unquote, and that means, says the Torah's Kohanim, hamayim ein bo tfisas yad klal, safa mikveh ein bo tfisas yad klal. So the mikveh should not be constructed in any way which is direct human involvement. I mean, obviously a person is building a mikveh, but you can't pour the water, for example, into the mikveh. Besides everything else, that's a problem with tfisaso aideonim. Now, if the guy draws water from a well, even with a leaky bucket, and pours in a mikveh, that's too much direct human intervention in filling the mikveh. In other words, the person is the one who pulled it out. But if he does hamshacha into the wooden pipe, then the hamshacha, the rolling, renders his tfisa as batel. Right? So I can't pick it up. That already makes it tfisa aideonim. But when I pour it in the ground, it rolls on the ground, that's mevatel, the tfisa aideonim. This was the artifice designed by Aftalion Concilio in his mikvah in Rovigo. Subsequently, Aftalion moved and he sold, or maybe gifted, the house and the premises to his brother Yukasio with instructions to adhere to Aftalion's unique mikvah protocols. However, when Aftalion later visited his former residence, he saw that changes had been introduced by his brother Yekusiel. For one thing, Yekusiel had plugged up the hole in the side of the bucket. Those issues of affairs I note, retaining only the little holes at the bottom of the bucket. Obviously, it must have been too much of a tercha. And actually, Yekusiel replaced the original bucket, and the holes at the bottom of the new bucket were smaller. Avtalion freaked out. He grabbed the Sefer Torah and he pronounced a cherem on the mikvah, forbidding anyone from using it, any woman from using it. And if she did, she would remain a nida. Now, I'll tell you right now, he was careful to say, this is Mikal Haba. I'm not saying that any woman who used the mikvah in the past before I showed up, that, was a nida or something like that, has implications. He said Mikal Haba. Yekusiel, who was the older brother, he freaked out in turn at Avtalion's unilateralism. Yekusiel consulted a nearby Rav, who said that the bucket was kosher and so was the mikveh, Yekusiel's bucket. Well, the molehill turned into a mountain as each brother solicited Pesukim from important rabbis in Italy. So it became a case of halolu osir v'halolu matir, as just about every rabbi and beis din in Italy weighed in. The Osrim published a collection of their tshuvas, which was called apparently Sefer Milchamas Hashem, right? But that was not the last word. Yekusiel solicited the views of the basin of Venice, which was a Choshava basin nearby. They came out for Yekusiel that the mikvah was kosher. They published a whole book, a fat book, with all their halachic reasoning, called Sefer Mashbis Milchamos, putting an end to the Milchama. As you can see over here, this, by the way, was published once in the early 1600s, in chicken scratch print, as you can imagine. I heard from Gnozim that many of them were published, so it's not even rare, but it's hard to read. Yeah, it's a pain in the neck to read. Recently, the Zichron put out a whole thing. Look at this, Kuntras Mikvah of Rovigo, and they reprinted in nice print all the old stuff, which is really a public service, in my opinion. Not that so many people are interested in this. By the way, the Hasidim say it's not Sefer Mashbis Mulchama, it's Sefer Sham Beis Mulchamas. But anyhow, and they, let's put it this way, they came out with all their reasoning, which includes, by the way, a very interesting and long tshuva from one of the interesting characters. I don't think I've ever done him. Simoni Luzzatto, of Simcha Luzzatto, who was on the basin of Venice, who had a PhD and wrote a famous thing on Socrates, besides being a dayan and a Talmud Chacham. Anyhow, Avtalion responded by soliciting opinions from all over Italy with detailed and specific hasagas on the halachic arguments in the Sefer Mashbis Mulchamas. Tit, tat, tit, tat. These he published as a rejoinder sefer called Sefer Palgamayim. Oh my, the tiny communities of North Italy, and they're small, produced a remarkable number of scholars and scholarly responsa. In the words of Pachad Yitzchak, who lived 100 years later, Rabbi Yitzchak Lampronti, who wrote that famous encyclopedia of the Talmud, and he lived in the 1700s when learning had gone down in Italy. He says, Habeit no ure'eh, ma'arocha mul ma'arocha, shisha ve'esrim rabbanim kodmim me'Italia, kishahoisa b'milua shel Torah. Right? When in the glory days of learning in Italy, nechlechu tes zayim misad echad le'asor, va'asor le'hatir. So Italy can't go by quantity, go by quality. To make matters worse, Avtalion, at one point, decided to go over the heads of the rabbis in Italy, and he wrote to the rabbis in Sfas, in Eretz Yisrael, to the great beis din there, which was headed at that time by the famous Maram Galanti, Rav Moshe Galanti, who was a Talmud Movik or Yosef Karo. He's the successor of Mabit. Not only did the beis din of Tzfat disqualify Yekusiel's mikvah, it also disqualified Avtalion's mikvah. So watch what you do when you write to Israel. There are too many opinions to write a comprehensive account of all of them. That would be a very long kind of article. Look at this. And it's all packed with information and solid stuff too. Right? It'd be hours to go through that. But the basics we can indeed access and sort of understand. And I have to tell you, in my humble opinion, the best um, summary, not exactly, of this whole thing in wonderfully lucid, clear language. It's in this wonderful sefer. Probably never heard of Divrei Emes from Yitzchak Bechar David, who was the chief rabbi in Istanbul in the 1700s. He's known in the world because the Noda Yehuda used to write them to submit that famous scandal in Brody, Evan Ezer 72. He sends it to him to say, "What do you think of my sefer, my tshuva?" And Yitzchak Bechar David, this thing here, which was recently reprinted from the old printing, and it's wonderful printing, is lumdus. You understand? This is sugyas. Okay, it's sugyas, and he calls it kutrasim, and yin gittin, and yin chashub, then yin lavin, chalav, divrei sofrim, trey v'trey, and that sort of thing. And one of them is kuntras al mikvos, in which he mentions what I'm talking about, the Mikvah of Rovigo. So if you're interested in going through it, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you go plow through this whole sefer, although that's the best way. But you can do it secondarily from the Divrei Emes from Yitzchak Bechar David, who you see here was a Go and Adir, and a wonderfully clear writer. It's not often you find writers, especially in the old days, who do lumdus in a very clear way. That's my personal opinion. Anyway, um, so here we go. And by the way, also has the Guinness Varodim, if you know, there's a big Sephardic Shagol in Egypt. These are all a generation or two later, 3 generations later. There were the Matirin and there were the Osrin. The Matirin pointed out the 2 features of the mikvah, the leaky bucket, and the fact that it was hamshachah. The water was not poured into the mikvah, it was poured onto the ground, into a leaky pipe, and the pipe led into the mikvah. The first feature reflects a Mishnah and a Shulchan Aruch, by the way, where the Mishnah says, Nikma bil matam etzad ve'inu chol kabel mayim kol shein ksheira v'kamin nekam b'shveres hanug. I read you that Mishnah before, which is in chapter 4, Mikvaos. So if there's a hole at the bottom, it's kosher. Now, some Rishonim read this a little bit differently. They say in order for a vessel to become a mikvah, it has to have a hole in the bottom. But I'm not going to go into that. I'll skip that part. It's not no good. Other Rishonim read it the way we're talking about, which is if you have a Shveferes Hanod, or you've had, even without that, because you only need Shveferes Hanod on the side for something else, if you have the holes, it's good enough. So Avtalion had followed the halacha. Let's put it that way. It is, by the way, in the Shulchan Aruch, Solomon Reshalef, If you look at Simon Mem, the Machaber says, Klisha Nakub B'Shulov, if you have a hole in the bottom, I feel a kolshov. Ain't a chashav kli lives on mikvah. Now it's true. The Shulchan Aruch goes on to say, Mikol mokum ein lahake lasas mitzvah chachilam lahavi mayim bekli minukov kazeh. V'maneka b'tzdan ein abatam mitaras kli ache rochav shurhes hanod. So in other words, the chachila you shouldn't do this. But I'll tell you right now, still a little homework. You look in the Chalkas Ben Yamin, which is like that modern sefer, like a Mishnah Berurah Mikvaos, and he says, "Midina shari b'nekel kolshu, al yesh lahachmir she'nekel b'shuras hanod." Really, a tiny hole suffices. As a chumrah, you have this. So you can't say the mikvah is not right, not good. So why had they said that? There has been another problem, of course. Tfisaso idea that the human involvement over here, the fact that he himself picked up the bucket, leaks and all, meant that a human was directly involved in making the mikvah. Okay? Because it says, Mamayan kul b'deshmayim, af mikvah kul b'deshmayim. And there's a whole to a seft over here that discusses this back and forth. I'll skip around. Basically, what it's saying is that, let's put it this way. If you have hamshacha, that takes care of that. I pick it up, I pour it in the ground, it rolls on the silver. The fact that I pour it directly into the mikvah, that makes it's not a problem with tfisas idea. Or am I wrong? This was the big fight. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't directly address this case, whether hamshacha can remedy the problem of tfisas idea. Rather, the Shulchan Aruch addresses the fact that hamshacha can remedy the problem of mayim shuvin. That is a famous old line. Okay? In other words, although there's a Taz, by the way, who says that hamshacha can remedy the problem of Tfisasei Dionim. Um, it's the Ber Hakev Nun Ches over in that chapter where he says, Kosabataz, Mashal Mishiviferes Hanod, maybe I feel Litchila, you can do it even Lechatchila. It's kosher b'sifa kodem kol madionim. Plus, what about the fact that it's Tfisasei Dionim? V'tzarech lomar, the Kan Mari Shalom Nishbach Hakli Al Yonam Ha'oso, El Manichu Samach HaMikvah, Mayim Boim Men Hakli LaMikvah. So in other words, we did Ram Shacham. So there that Taz is saying explicitly that Taz anyway, that Shacham would take care of the problem of Tfisasei Dionim. So why did the Basin say in Tzvas that Avtalion's way was puzzle? As far as I can see, it seems to be a case of She'uva Shemshichu Kula. Can you do a whole mikvah? Can an entire mikvah be composed of Mayim Shuvim if the water was poured directly onto the ground and flowed into the mikvah rather than being poured directly into the mikvah? The Shita you have in the Gemara is one is that She'uvin Shemshichu Kula, and the other way is Reviv Amshacha. The first way is you pour everything, meat. I pour it from a bucket onto the ground. The whole thing rolls in to the mikvah. I don't pour it directly into the mikvah. It rolls in the ground into the mikvah. And the other opinion is you can only do that with 49%. Rove, 51% have to be through rainwater. And the minority can then be through this tap water business. Okay? Through Hamshacha. When they said 3 lugan pops on the mikvah, it's when you pour it in directly. If you pour it in the ground, be okay. So the lenient opinion would be you can pour everything, all 40 saw, onto the ground, and then from there into the mikveh. And the other way would be they have to do 21 out of 40 saw, and then the rest could be, the 19 could be through a hamshacha, Mayim Shuvin, hamshacha. The Mishnah in Tamura, in 12a, says, Ein Mayim Shuvin Posen Mikveh Elafi Cheshvan. The Gemara there first tries to interpret it to mean Ravi of Amshacha, in other words, 49%, in line with the Shita of Elazar and Yaakov. Look it up. Who indeed says in the Tosefta of Meseftas Mikvaos that as long as the majority is rainwater, the minority can be Shuvin B'Amshacha. And the Gemara said that's his opinion, but the Rabbanan disagree. In other words, the Rabbanan would be Machmer and say it has all rainwater and no Amshacha. No Shubin even B'Amshach at all. But the Gemara challenges what I just said, because it says Rabbi Yochanan clearly stated, Rabbi Yochanan, She'uva Shemshichu Kula Torah. That even if you poured the whole thing, all 40 saw, through Amshacha, through pouring on the ground and rolling a mikveh, it'd be kosher. So the Gemara changes its mind and explains the Mishnah differently. And in regard to this final interpretation, Rashi says, Rabbanan L'Kula Pligi. Rabbanan L'Kula Pligi. Meaning that they would indeed hold that the whole mikvah could be from Mayim Shuvin that was poured not in the mikvah, but poured in the ground and rolled in the mikvah. All 40 saw no rainwater at all. So what's the din? I mean, you and I know it's not the way we paskin, but it's not so paskin. The Rif did paskin that way, that the whole thing could be Mayim Shuvin indirectly poured into the mikvah by Hamshacha on the ground and rolled in the mikvah. In the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam says, Eina Mayim Shuvin posas a mikvah b'shlosh alugin ad sheyipol tok mikvah min akli. That Mayim Shuvin will only pass on a mikvah if you pour it directly into the mikvah. Of a nigra Mayim Shuvin chutz a mikvah nimshach liyado Mayim, but it's Hamshacha, you poured the 3 lugin on the ground and rolled into the mikvah. Eina posas a mikvah ad shemechsa mechsa. Then it wouldn't pass on the mikvah only if it was more than 49%. It was 50%. That'd be too much. I'm rov min aksher mikvah kosher. But if it was rov, in other words, 21 saw out of 40, that was rainwater, then the rest could be shuvin b'amshacha. Okay? And he goes on to explain it, etc., etc. Okay? And then the Rambam says, in Halacha Test, this is all in chapter 4, in Hilchos Mikvaos. The Rambam says, Horu mixes chachmei maro. Here's the history part. Some of the chachmei maro, some of the big rabbis of Morocco and southern Spain, said, since the Gemara that I just mentioned before in Tamura says, she'uben shemshichu kula Torah, and that was Rabbi Yochanan. Enon tzrichin shamayim ksherin. That means what it says. You can pour the whole 40 saw in. You don't need rove of rainwater or anything like that. The Mishnah talks about Ruvav Amshacha. There'd only be 49%. That was the opinion of one, but the Rov, the Chachamim, are more mekel. Shari Amru, Besov Shubin Shemshichel Kula Torah. Lafi Divri that, and Rama says, if you follow that opinion, if you did all 40 saw on the ground, meaning you poured in the ground and rolled in the mikvah, hari is a mikvah kosher. And that's true. All the bathtubs work as a mikvah. Because in Rambam's time, they must have been stuck in the ground. And I guess the way you poured, you didn't pour the water in the old days, I suppose, directly into the bathtub. Poured it into something that rolled in the bathtub. Therefore, you got a mikvah if it's 150 gallons. Shari kol mayim shov nimshachu. It's all mayim shuvin, but it was nimshach, it was hamshacha. I never seen a mikvah like that, Rambam says. In other words, the Rif Paskin, that all 40 saw can be from buckets as long as it's hamshacha, for the reasons the Rambam outlined, causing more and tomorrow. His own opinion, the Rambam's own opinion is reserved. Never actually seen anybody do this. And remember, the Rambam lived in Morocco for many years. I just gave a speech on this Shabbos. And he was kind of a Talmud of the Rif. In other words, this is interesting historically. The Rambam is a student of his father, Maimon. Maimon learned by the Rimigash. Rimigash was the Yeshiva Lucina. The Rimigash was the Talmud Milka of the Rif. Right? It's true that the Rif wasn't the only source in the Rambam. Before him was Ritzkias and others. So there was like a Spanish Andalusian Torah tradition which mixed together with the Rif. But nevertheless, the Rif is very, very important. And the Rambam tells elsewhere that, he was like super. And Rambam said, we don't pass like him here. Now, what's interesting to me is, it's fascinating for any story, that this I read you is from the Mishnah Torah, which the Rambam wrote in his 30s. But if you compare with what he wrote in the Pirush Mishnayos, which he wrote in his 20s, okay, he uses stronger language. This is what he says in the Pirush Mishnayos. I'm quoting from the translation from Kapach because it's all in Arabic. But Kvardima Adam Gadol Ma'od Bal Iyun Be'eretz Germana. It was already imagined by Adam Gadol Ma'od Bal Iyun, a real brain in Morocco. Kishuv Hashem Shichu Kol Kshera. The whole Mayim Shuvin, as long as you did Hamshacha, is kosher. I feel mid kosher if the whole 40 saw was that way. V'nevach al kach bezeres ma'ama. And he battled for his opinion, tooth and nails, we would say. So even when the Rif said this, Rambam's telling us. Now the Rif died in the 1000s, and of course the Rambam 1090, I think, and the Rambam was born in 1138, so it's not that long afterwards. So he had memories of this. He fought for this, for some besifro, Kila Mishnah, and he wrote this in a sefer, the Rif. Kila Mishnah zu no nichtav klal, as if the Mishnah that the Rambam was commenting on, Perik Daled, Mishnah Daled, had never existed. But he's wrong. If the Rif was right, your Mishnah is a puzzle. The Mishnah would never talk about rove and meat because you could pour all 40 of the saw as long as you did about shacha and make a mikvah. Shafil lohay make shamin klal. You don't need any rainwater, according to the Rif. Elamayim shuvim bilvad. And as long as they were rolling the ground or on a cave or whatever, miskabetz and make a kosher. This is wrong. And the Rambam goes on to say, Vasher garam l'chol ha'omo v'yiyas chinam hu, and what caused all this terrible mistake and waste of time that he battled for an opinion and his sheet and all the rest, all of it was wrong. Miyut zechiras hamishnah v'o'iyim b'masha nichtaba. He said the Rif was like yeshivish. He learned Mishnayos, learned Gemara. Miyut, it's amazing to me. Miyut zechiras hamishnah v'o'iyim b'masha nichtaba. He wasn't minding the Mishnayos. He was spending all his time with the Gemara. Great as he was, Kamot Sotka Devrim, and the Rambam says in regard to this, how true were the words of Chazal. Imra Isa Talmud Chacham, Shetalmudo Kol Biyado, Keo Biyado Kabarzel, Al Mishnoso Shenis Dur B'Fiv. Not holding the Mishnais. This is like a plug for Mishnah Yomis and all that. This is sharp criticism of the Rif by a 20-something-year-old Rambam. Anyhow, the halacha l'maisa is not she'uvin shemshichu kula, but reviv amshacha, that if 49%, less than half, can be amshacha. In other words, mayim shuvin cannot be kosher if all of it is poured through amshacha. And of course, in Avtalian's case, it was all poured. But in other words, none of it was rainwater. It's all taken from the well in that leaky bucket. Now, the water wasn't mayim shuvin because the bucket was leaky, but it was tfisas ayidiyanim, which is a different defect. The question of whether kula b'hamshacha can remedy the defect of tfisas ayidiyanim is not addressed in the Gemara Rishon, as far as I know, and that's what led to the controversy. That's my understanding. In other words, we know about she'uvin b'hamshacha, but what if it's so? In other words, hamshacha gets rid of the problem of mayim shuvin, but there was also a case of tfisas ayidiyanim because he himself manually picked up the bucket, leak it all, and poured it on the ground into the mikvah, on the ground, and rolled it in the mikvah. So that's tfisas ayidiyanim. Is the fact that it was b'hamshacha, does that remedy the tfisas ayidiyanim the same way it remedies the defect of mayim shuvin? Doesn't say. As is to be expected, there was a certain amount of mudslinging in all these opposing responsa. Both brothers, Avtalian and Yukasiel, were Talmidei Chachamim, respected Talmidei Chachamim, students of the famous Mar Shmuel Yehuda Katz and Ellenbogen, the Abbezin of Venice, the son of Mar and Padua, and more or less the Gadol Ador at that time, I guess, in Spain. I'm sorry, in Italy. I did him once in a podcast long ago. He was a major posik and tzaddik. Yukasiel of the two brothers seems to come across more like an Askin type. A Stadlin type, if what I read was correct. Avtalian, who said it's all puzzle, was criticized by the other side because Avtalian was an Italian Jew. The Italian Jews, the Frum, drank non-kosher wine. By that I mean it's not treif, but it's a stamiena. It's notorious in Italy for a long time, including Shmuel Yehuda Katz and Logenbach and others, Gedolim. They didn't observe the problem of stamiena. They bought wine in a store, like that. Like if I went to a liquor store. I'm not talking about yayin nesach, obviously, but that's what they did. And they used to say like this: how come you're machmir on water and you're makel on yayin? Right? Avtalian first defended the Italian minhag. He later recanted in print, and then orally said he recanted his recantation. What was the end of the Pulmas on Mikvah of Rovigo? It went on and on for quite a while, but in the big Sephardi responsive world, it didn't reach the Ashkenazic world as far as I can tell. And some big Sephardi Gedolim defended the Mikvah on various grounds, like the Maram ben, later, in subsequent generations, the Maram ben Chabib said that, look at this, here's the well, here's the Mikvah. I'm picking up the bucket. I mean, the mikvah is close to the well. I'm picking up the bucket and going like this. So look, the bucket, how should I do it over here? Imagine it's the bucket, right? So I'm picking up the bucket and I'm pouring it in the mikvah. So at the same time, it's still leaking out, because it's still leaking out into the mikvah. I'm sorry, still leaking out into the well, but at the same time it's pouring into the mikvah. So you see my point? It's like one long line going down here and going down here. That's like a nitzik and a katafis. And sometimes it's a chibur under these circumstances without going through all the lumdus of it. But sometimes it is as a chibur or not. And he said it should work on that way, meaning through hashaka. You get it? So that would, how did I put over here? The leaky bucket leaked back into the well, and at the same time was pouring into the wooden pipe on the ground. You had one long connected stream of water, and therefore you had hashaka, because in this specific scenario, A nisik and a katafris could indeed affect the chibur. And if you want to see the lumdus, look in the Marit, Your Day at 217. All kind of technical things like that. It's really wonderful. What was the maskana? Everybody gave in there and built a regular mikvah. Okay, a regular standing mikvah. Why should you tell people to go to a mikvah which is controversial? You see? Why do you want your wife or somebody to go to mikvah? Some hold yes, some hold no. Better to do it that everybody agrees it's a kosher mikvah. Right? You know what I mean? In other words, Avtali wasn't crazy. He worked this out. And he timed it, and he had good reason. And it's justifiable. Because it stands on solid halachic grounds. But if it's a whole big Torah, to build a regular mikvah and act with it. That's what happened. So there's a little bit of a tempest in a teapot. But meanwhile, look at the amount of Torah that emerged from all these fighting back and forth and all the lumdus in there. Because they go after everything, go through whole shots and poskim. This is what I want to say. Today was my father's Yahrtzeit, and my father, of course, was in the war. My father did not go through a mikvah of water. I don't think he ever went to a mikvah. I remember when I was a kid. He didn't do that in Baltimore. On the other hand, he did go through a 4-year mikvah of fire during the Shoah, or maybe a mikvah of blood, of dam. It's much harder, we know, to go through that kind of mikvah than to take a dunk in a comfortable heated pool. And I think each kind of mikvah in its own way is matire in its own way. On the other hand, we know no mikvah of water or fire or blood can be matire from tumas mace. That's when you need a paraduma, right? And people who went through the Second World War like him, I would say were contaminated by a psychological kind of tumas mace. You know, after he's seen so much and he buried so many people and all this tortures. And there wasn't a paraduma for the survivors of the Shoah who went through the camps. And so survivors either had to pull themselves up on their own or else drown in their own suffering. And like many people who went through the war, my father had plenty of nightmares and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, he got on with his life in as constructive a manner as possible. That's the tribute. I want to conclude by saying that now this is being in the Tufshin Pei Hey in January of 2025. The same thing is going to happen now, I predict, with the Chatufim. I'm delivering this talk that I just concluded in the week when the hostages are little by little being released, saw by saw, drop by drop. And thank God whoever gets out. But they've gone through hell, and they've gone through a mikvah of fire and blood, and psychological torture. And it's not going to be so pushing for them to get rid of tumas mace, all the junk that they've seen in captivity in Gaza and other by these areas. And we hope and pray they will also somehow or other find within themselves, or Israel should help them, the Jewish people should help them to get past their tsaras. And you can't forget what happened to you, but you can resolve to build on the ruins and build a worthwhile life. Amen. King Ratzon. Anyway, that's wanted to share that with you. On this occasion, it's my father's 51st Yahrtzeit.